Hello all. Here in this video we shall try to understand what is frequency, wavelength and a relation between them. The first definition that comes into our brain is frequency. What do you mean by frequency? Frequency is that the number of cycles per second is called as frequency. What do you mean by the number of cycles per second? Number of times the cycles repeat for a given time period or for a given second is what we call it as frequency. So that is what it is. Number of times it occurs, the complete waveform occurs for the given time or for the considered time, which is called as 1 second, is what we call it as frequency. Okay, fine. So what do you mean by cycle? Cycle is that one complete set of positive half cycle and negative half cycle is called as one cycle. So let us understand one cycle. Here what we say in this diagram we can understand better. One complete positive half cycle and one complete negative half cycle put together, okay, they put together, it is called as one complete cycle. Fine. So what do you mean by frequency then? Those cycles, whatever that we have discussed, the number of cycles that repeats per given second is what we call it as frequency. Fine. So now let us understand what is wavelength. Okay, so wavelength, what he says, the wavelength is the length of one complete cycle is called as wavelength. So what do you mean by wavelength? The exact length of one complete cycle is called as wavelength. So this is the length, or as he has mentioned here, you can just understand this is the wavelength. So the length of one complete wave when it starts from 90 degree and reaches 90 degree, this is called as one wavelength. Okay, and even you can consider the wavelength from the 0 position to 0. This length, whatever that we have, this is what we call it as wavelength, lambda. Fine. So this is what we call it as wavelength, and we know the definition of cycles and we know the definition of frequency. So now let us understand the important thing. Okay, what is the important thing? That is the relationship between frequency and wavelength. The relationship between frequency and wavelength. The frequency and wavelength are related as follows. The frequency and wavelength are related as follows. What do you mean by lambda? Lambda is the wavelength. What do you mean by c? C is the speed of light. What do you mean by f? F is the frequency. Okay, so these three are the things that we are going to relate, wherein the lambda is equal to wavelength is given by, always wavelength is given by c by speed of light divided by frequency. Lambda is inversely proportional to frequency. This is what the relationship between wavelength and frequency. Okay, so lambda is the wavelength, f is the frequency. As lambda increases, frequency decreases. As frequency increases, lambda decreases. What do you mean by lambda? Wavelength. What do you mean by f? Frequency. So this is the relationship between wavelength and frequency. And the relation between frequency and wavelength is as shown. Lambda is inversely proportional to frequency, wherein the same can be understood by using this diagram also. So here the waveform in this we shall consider two waveforms. In the first waveform which we are going to consider, the wavelength is more, the length of the wave is more. Fine. So that is why the frequency is less, or the occurrence of the cycles, number of cycles is less for the given period of time. Let us consider this is the period of time. So for the given period of time, the number of cycles that occurs are less. Okay, So that is why as wavelength increases, frequency decreases. Fine. So let us understand the other part in the one more waveform. Okay, here what happens, the wavelength is reduced. We have a reduced wavelength, a short wavelength. Okay, so as wavelength reduces, as lambda reduces, what should increase? Frequency will increase. You see, let us consider the similar time period over here. For the same time period, we have two number of cycles. We have how many number of cycles? We have two number of cycles. So as wavelength decreases, what happens to frequency? Frequency increases. As wavelength decreases, frequency increases. So this is what the relationship. As frequency reduces, what happens to wavelength? Wavelength increases. Frequency reduces, wavelength increases. As wavelength reduces, frequency increases. This is what the relationship between those two, wavelength and frequency. Okay.